My mother-in-law, Nancy, was an art historian and seemed to know everything about the exhibitions of all the museums in Chicago. That would have been all right, but she was always dragging her friends and acquaintances to all kinds of exhibitions, because such a passionate woman had few close friends. So my wife, Jessica, and I often had to go with her. These trips could be tedious, especially since Nancy shared every detail she knew with boundless enthusiasm, and we would spend hours wandering the galleries listening to her detailed explanations. Jessica usually enjoyed these walks, but for me they were a test of patience. On the other hand, I simply did not understand the meaning of this endless admiration of priceless exhibits. I was generally quite skeptical of paintings. In my mind, a drawing created in a computer program or a beautiful modern photograph had more appeal than the work of some long-dead bearded artist. When it came to explicit subjects in paintings or sculptures, I had something of an adolescent attitude. Seeing nudes made me feel like a curious teenage boy. I couldn't escape the feeling of detachment from these exhibits. They seemed so disconnected from the world in which I lived. When Nancy, with a serious look, began to talk about the subject or details of an exhibit, I couldn't suppress a laugh. In this painting, the artist wanted to show a mother's suffering because her son is going off to war and will likely never return. She declared with a mixture of importance and pathos. Despite all her wealth, she could not keep her son out of the army. She would then call attention to details such as the folds on her stomach mean that a person needs to eat less flour. I found her analysis both amusing and disconcerting. The seriousness with which she talked about the most mundane details seemed almost comical to me. Nancy noticed my lack of seriousness and with a disapproving glance, stopped inviting me to exhibitions for a few weeks, which I was glad of. I finally had a break from the endless explanations and awkward attempts to look interested. But one day I ran into my mother-in-law under unusual and unexpected circumstances that changed everything. Then I was still a student, so I tried to moonlight always and everywhere I could. Constantly lacking money, I was ready to do almost any legal job, and one of such jobs was modeling a rather rare occupation. I didn't suffer from insecurity. I was young and good-looking, so showing off my abs in front of strangers didn't bother me at all. And if there were men among the performers, I just ignored them. I didn't do anything risky, and I had nothing to be ashamed of. When I was asked to sit still for a couple of hours, I rejoiced. Easy money meant a couple of pizzas for my wife and me, and maybe even a night out at the movies. I undressed in the locker room, put on a robe, and headed into the studio. The instructor introduced me to everyone. This is Michael, our model for today. We will be painting the nude male figure. I didn't listen to the details. I wasn't interested in them. I was used to turning off my brain and thinking about something else. It was almost meditative, in a way, holding a pose and letting my thoughts drift, imagining myself anywhere but in this studio. After a while, I started looking around at the artists, trying to distract myself. Fortunately, there were no men among them, but one of the female artists kept hiding behind her easel, as if shy. Judging by her sensible shoes, she was clearly an older lady, not a young student. I looked at her again, and my eyes widened. I'd seen those shoes dozens of times as I stood next to their owner, bored to death in endless museum halls. They belonged to Nancy. She clearly recognized me, and meeting under such awkward circumstances made her avoid eye contact for the rest of the session. Only a couple of times did she peek out from behind her easel, and each time she met my gaze, she hid again. To be honest, I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable too. It wasn't exactly normal to have your mother-in-law looking at you, sketching every detail of your body. I started to feel a sense of vulnerability that I hadn't felt before, and it made me wonder why I had taken the job in the first place. When the class finally ended, Nancy left first. I got dressed, thanked the instructor, and headed home. A few hours later, still feeling uneasy about the encounter, my phone rang. To my surprise, it was Nancy. "Hi, Michael. Listen, could you come over to my house?" It's hard to explain over the phone. Her voice sounded unusually nervous. There was a note in her tone that I had never heard before, and it further fueled my curiosity. I hesitated, but finally agreed, more out of curiosity than obligation. She met me at her home in casual clothes, and I could tell from her pale expression that today's events had affected her greatly. I could see the worry in her eyes, and it was clear she was struggling with something. "So today's class didn't quite go as planned, did it?" I smiled awkwardly, trying to lighten the mood. "You're right," she said. "I need to finish the painting." Her voice trembled slightly. and I felt the vulnerability behind her words. "Are you serious? Why not just improvise?" I asked, a little embarrassed. I couldn't understand why she was so eager to finish the painting exactly as it was. "Because the point is to capture exactly what I saw. If I improvise, everyone will notice and I'll lose credibility." Her eyes met mine for a moment, and I realized how much this meant to her. There was more to it than just finalizing a painting. It felt personal. It suddenly occurred to me that it might not just be about the art. Could there be another reason behind her insistence? "Can I see what you've already painted?" I asked. "No, please. I'd rather show you the finished version," she replied, seemingly embarrassed. But as I walked past her workstation, I caught a glimpse of her drawing. Surprisingly, it was almost complete, and I looked almost exactly like the original, except for the large unfinished area around my stomach. The rest of the figure was drawn with incredible detail, and I couldn't help but admire her talent. I wasn't sure if Nancy had deliberately left that part for later or if she just hadn't gotten the job done, but either way it meant she would be looking at that part of me again. I reluctantly took my seat, trying to distract myself by looking out the window, but the absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore. Nancy was sketching every detail in complete silence, concentrating intently. My body involuntarily reacted to this attention, and I felt myself changing. I tried to remain calm, but the tension in the room was palpable, and it made it hard to focus on anything else. "Michael, what's going on?" she asked, clearly agitated. Her voice broke the silence, and it startled me. "Nancy, I'm really sorry. This isn't exactly normal," I admitted, embarrassed. I felt the heat rush to my face and realized I was blushing. To my surprise, she smiled. "I like you, Michael," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know what to say back. Time seemed to stop, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Everything fell into place. The art class, the sudden invitation to her house, it was all a ploy to spend time alone with me. As if struck by an electric shock, I found myself drawn to her. I stood up, walked over to Nancy, and looked into her eyes. What I saw in them was unmistakable agreement and expectation. Her vulnerability was exposed, and it was clear that she had been struggling with those feelings for a long time. Without a word, I lifted her into my arms, looking for a place to lay her down. The next few moments passed like a blur, and when it was over, I realized that I might be ready to be her personal model for a long time. The intensity of the experience took my breath away, and as we lay there, I wondered how things had escalated so quickly. There was a strange sense of connection between us that I hadn't felt before. In the days that followed, Nancy and I came to an unspoken understanding. She continued to paint, and I began to visit her home more often than I could have imagined. Each time, the tension between us grew, and the line between model and artist blurred more and more. I knew it was wrong, but there was something intoxicating about the secrecy, the thrill of doing something forbidden. I couldn't deny the attraction I felt for her, and she seemed to feel the same way. I began to see Nancy in a different light. She wasn't just my mother-in-law, but a woman with desires, passions, and vulnerabilities. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how much we had in common. We talked about art, about life, about Jessica. It was strange discussing my wife with her mother, knowing what we do, but it also brought us closer in some ways. There was a closeness in our conversations that I had never experienced with anyone else. One evening, as we were sitting in her living room after another session, Nancy looked at me and said, "Michael, I know this can't last forever." There was sadness in her voice, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. "I know," I replied. "But for now, let's just enjoy it." She nodded, and we sat in silence, feeling the weight of our situation weighing on us. It was complicated and confusing and wrong, but it was real. And that was enough for the moment.